Well, I'm delighted to be speaking with Richard Overy, whose book Reign of Ruin, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and the Surrender of Japan is just out as we speak. A sort of condensed view of the subject, but to my mind, it never feels skimpy or rushed. And it's not so dense with material that it's an intimidating read. Richard, yes, of course, it's a horrifying experience reading it, and yet it is an enthralling read at the same time. So thank you very much indeed for the work that you've put in on it. And,
Thank you.
taking us through the narrative, it does seem that perhaps the best place to start is getting a sense from you of how widespread the Japanese empire was during the Second World War at its fullest extent. We get that sort of geographical picture before we home in on the end of the war.
Well, the Japanese Empire was a very large one, constructed very quickly. Before the onset of Japan's imperialism in the 1930s, there was basically Korea and Taiwan made up the Japanese Empire. But within the space of a dozen years, the Japanese added Manchuria, almost the whole of northern China, Inner Mongolia. And then when war broke out in 1941, they added Hong Kong, effectively Vietnam under their control, Malaya, Burma, Indonesia, most of the islands of the Western Pacific. So this was a large territorial empire, not quite as large as the British, but it was, the aim was to rival the British and create their own empire.
Okay, so Pearl Harbor, 1941, brings the United States in. The war in the Pacific gets ever more extraordinary in the ferocity of what goes on. But by the time we get to, shall we say, the midsummer of 1945, how far has that Japanese empire shrunk?
Well, it hasn't shrunk very much. I mean, that's in some sense the surprising thing because we have to recall a few months before Germany is defeated. The Germany is defeated because almost the whole of Germany's home territory has been occupied and conquered by the Allies. Actually, by the summer of 1945, Japan has lost most of the islands it occupied in the Central Pacific. It's actually made more gains recently in China. It's lost Burma, and it's being challenged now across Indonesia. But actually, much of the original conquests from the 1930s is still there.
So, what is the prospect of the United States swiftly ending the war by the recapturing, as it were, of territory? I mean, how long might it have gone on?
Well, the Americans were not much interested in territory. They began from the outset the idea that they were not going to send troops into China. They were not going to get bogged down in mainland China, which is why they struggled across the Central Pacific, island after island, bloody battle after bloody battle, because they thought the only way you can bring the Japanese to defeat, given the geographical isolation of Japan, was actually to get near enough to be able to launch waves of bombers on the one hand, and to be able to launch an amphibious assault as well. So for the Americans, the rest of the war against the Japanese was largely irrelevant. In fact, they focused simply on their central strategy across the Pacific, getting near enough to the home islands to be able to inflict sufficient damage to try to make the Japanese surrender.
So what, even though it may be obvious, what makes the Japanese war machine so fearsome? What is it about the Japanese that they're able to seize and hold this territory?
Well, I think we tend to exaggerate. I mean, the problem is that for the British and French and Dutch empires and the American possessions in the Pacific, they were very poorly defended. Weak in terms of material, weak in terms of manpower. And so the Japanese didn't have to deploy a great deal of military might to be able to conquer this area, as indeed I think the British had already realized. In China, it was a different prospect, but Chiang Kai-shek's armed forces were so feeble, they were able to keep the Japanese occupied, but not really to inflict severe damage on them. And so again, the Japanese were able to hold on to China with a relatively small military effort. And of course, the Japanese war economy was a fraction of the size of the Soviet war economy or the American war economy. So we have something of a mirage, really. I think, the Japanese look much stronger than they actually are. They're favored by geography more than anything else.
Well, one of the most fascinating things in the book is to see the shift in public opinion in the United States as well as military opinion when it came to the bombing of civilian areas. And I wonder if you could just take us through that very, very simply.
Well, yes, one of the things I wanted to highlight in the book, in fact, is the conventional bombing of Japan's urban areas, because that tends to get neglected. It's in the shadow all the time of the atomic bombs. Um, that was something that had been vaguely planned from 1930. When you get near enough to Japan, you'll be able to inflict serious damage on them. But they couldn't, of course, until they got bases close enough in late 1944. And then they didn't have aircraft in sufficient numbers to be able to inflict much damage. And so the leaders of the American Air Force got very fed up because the Navy and the Army seemed to be doing everything, and they were not doing a great deal. And so when they got near enough, the bomber force under Curtis LeMay uh, was more or less told, if you you've got to try and inflict damage so that the Air Force, has a profile in the end of this war. And LeMay decided the best way to do that was to, use incendiary bombs to burn down the center of Japanese cities, which were highly inflammable. And that's what he did for 5 months, burnt down 60% of the urban area.
But was that a change in the thinking about the morality of bombing civilians? Had that always been in the mindset that this was something that was justifiable?
Well, it had been justified in the European war, of course, by RAF Bomber Command. No, American Air Force had focused on precision bombing, partly because they didn't want to damage civilians, but partly because it seemed to them to make greater strategic sense to knock out factories and oil refineries and so on. But when they got to Japan, first of all, it was very difficult to find where they were, the things they needed to bomb precisely. Very difficult indeed to hit them. And they worked out an argument that somehow or other the Japanese war economy was spread out in the urban area, in little workshops, even in private homes where people were making parts for planes and sending them to the assembly areas and so on. And therefore, when you were burning down the city, you were not just killing civilians, but you were killing civilian workers for the war effort and destroying the components and supplies that the major factories needed. So they gave a kind of gloss to it, but actually they knew perfectly well that when you drop incendiaries on the center of a wooden city, you burn it down and you burn down the people inside.
And when we're talking about at the most something like 60 Japanese cities, is it, that are incendiary bombed? Have I got that figure roughly speaking right?
Well, no, 60% of the urban area of Japan. And if you think about, 60% of the urban area of Britain, you think about that, it's an extraordinary statistic. And it's aided, of course, by the fact that most Japanese cities are predominantly made of wood, so that they are easy to burn down. Otherwise, it would have been a much slower process. In Europe, it was difficult to burn down German cities because they were made of stone and brick. In Japan, it was easy.
Was there any sense, Richard, in which they thought of bombing civilians as payback for the inhumanity of Pearl Harbor and the inhumanity of the way in which Japanese soldiers fought and treated prisoners, for example? Did that play into it at all?
Well, it played in one important sense that all American military leaders had this sense of a kind of toxic armed force they were facing. It did terrible things, atrocious things, um, and so doing the same sort of thing to the Japanese didn't seem quite so bad as doing the same thing to Germans, for example. Although Germans did wicked things, the Americans felt quite differently about the Germans. They did about the Japanese. Um, it doesn't actually feature, of course, in doctrine, in strategy, and so on. You can't say that, but we do know from the record that Arnold, the commander in chief of the American Air Force, um, realized that there was really no moral objection to doing this to Japanese because they'd done so many horrible things to other people. I mean, that's a rather specious argument when what you're really doing is burning down city centers and killing thousands of women and children.
Yeah. So give us a sense of just what a firestorm was, how horrific it really was.
Well, the first storm, I mean, the worst one was in Tokyo in March 1945. And that was because so much incendiary material was dropped on a very small area of lots of little cramped wooden houses together. Um, Now, the Japanese civilians were told, they were ordered to stay and try and rescue their house. That was the official line. But of course, you couldn't once the fire got going. Um, and so they fled, and thousands of them managed to flee the flames. But the flames very quickly um, uh, developed a high speed so that they could move faster than people could run away from them. And that meant in the end that the people who couldn't escape were consumed, carbonized, reduced to ash. And on the following morning, that's really what all the police could find. They found piles of carbonized bodies and thick layers of ash, which you then had to estimate how many people that had amounted to. So it's a horrific thing, a firestorm.
Yeah. So if it's so horrific, why drop an atom bomb?
Well, that's a good question, because in fact, the May could easily have done to Hiroshima the same amount of damage that the atom bomb did in a night of bombing. As the American Air Force commanders realized, uh, you drop an atom bomb because the scientists and the military involved in developing it were convinced by the summer that it would be a shock to the Japanese, a shock sufficient to make the Japanese surrender. And that's what the president hoped. President Truman hoped that if you dropped atomic bombs, horrible though they were, it would actually force the Japanese hand. They would have to surrender.
But were there other factors in here that if you spent untold billions on researching the atom bomb, there's got to be sort of like an end product, and it is a sort of experiment dropping a bomb on
Yes, yes. Well, that's a very good term. It is a kind of scientific experiment, exactly that. I mean, the scientists at Los Alamos under Oppenheimer, made famous now by the recent film, were obsessed with getting a bomb finished in time. They worked 18 hours a day. They did everything they could to engineer a bomb so that it could be used. And once they got a bomb, the scientists and the military leaders thought, well, we have to use it because that's the whole purpose of producing this bomb, this huge effort. And how will we use it? We will use it on the center of the city because if we do that, we can then look afterwards and gauge the amount of damage it did, see what a bomb does. So it's a horrible, cynical view of why you drop a bomb. You want to see what it does.
So uh, I'm sure there were people that argued. I think there were, if remember what I read in your book, there will have been people that said, "Well, why don't we drop this in a country area close to Hiroshima or wherever, and still demonstrate the awesome power of an atom bomb?"
Yes, no, I mean, there were people who argued for a demonstration. In fact, quite a lot of the scientists who were working remotely from where Oppenheimer was, in other universities and so on, really objected to the idea of dropping a bomb or using the bomb at all, even though they'd taken part in its development. A rather strange, rather paradoxical position, actually. But yes, there were plenty of people who argued that. But they
Was,
said, it's not going to demonstrate enough.
yeah.
It won't make Japanese surrender.
Was there any sense in which dropping the bomb was a statement to Russia at all, who's expanding eastwards and is a threat to Japan in fact. But it's clear that Russia is going to be a major power after the war, and here is a sort of statement of American power.
Yes, I mean that was the argument in the middle of the Cold War. It was assumed that America must have done it in order to intimidate the Russians. It didn't do that, and it certainly wasn't their purpose. It's not, it's not in the documents. Um, what it did was the opposite. It actually, the dropping the bomb on Hiroshima worried Stalin because he wanted to gain a lot in East Asia, and he'd been promised it by Roosevelt and Churchill at the Yalta Conference. He wanted to make those gains before Japan surrendered. So he was very worried. So he in fact sped up the program of Soviet expansion in East Asia as a result of the bomb, not slowed down.
Yeah. So the bomb is dropped. Does it have the desired effect in terms of persuading the Japanese authorities, Japanese hierarchy, that they must surrender?
Well, that's the heart of the book, of course. Um, and for 80 years, that's been the prevailing view, and indeed it's still the prevailing view. Recent histories of Hiroshima and so on have come back to that point. That in the end, that's what tipped the balance. I would argue a very different case. The conventional bombing was much more important. It created a real social and economic crisis in Japan, and the emperor and the elite were worried that it might lead even to a revolution like Russia in 1917. So the atomic bombs were just two more destroyed cities alongside all the other cities. But the real problem was they didn't know quite what it was. Even though the Americans sent information after Hiroshima, they were skeptical about this. They didn't quite know what it was or what its impact was likely to be. And indeed, some of the army leaders argued that it was survivable, like conventional bombing. And by the time Emperor Hirohito accepted the American ultimatum 4 days after Hiroshima, the report about Hiroshima had not even arrived in Tokyo. What really prompted that decision was the Soviet invasion of Manchuria on the morning of August the 9th. And that really did make it clear that communism was the threat. What happens if Stalin gets here before the Americans? Hard to imagine, except you could see what was happening in Eastern Europe. So the atom bombs need to be put into that context. It's part of the story, but only a part.
And what's fascinating is to see how the Emperor Hirohito effectively sticks his neck out beyond what is constitutionally viable, acceptable, in being the person who ultimately makes the decision to surrender.
Yes, that was the problem all along. That Hirohito didn't really have the constitutional right to do that. The cabinet and the Supreme War Council had to have a unanimous view and would then bring it to the emperor, and he would rubber stamp it. In extremis, it would be possible for the emperor to make what's called a sacred decision. It's sacred because he's, of course, an emperor god. A sacred decision which would resolve any disputes among the elite. And it took a long time to get to that position. Hirohito kept pushing them, pushing them, pushing them, and the military and the civilians kept arguing about this and that. What will the Americans do? What does it mean? And so on and so on and so on, until they reached a point with the Soviet invasion where Hirohito said, "Right, that's it. Come on, we're having a meeting." They had an imperial council meeting, and Hirohito said, "I'm sorry, you've got to accept the ultimatum, and in the end, you've all got to agree with me." The cabinet went away, voted in favour, and the ultimatum was accepted partially.
Yeah. And the word surrender is not a word that is actually used on the Japanese side.
No, never. No,
Well, you
no,
say never, never. So does that mean up to today?
no. Up to the day, they tend not to talk about it in those terms. Surrender, capitulation. These words were not to be used in front of the emperor. Termination of the war. And the impression given throughout is that it's Hirohito who's taken this decision. He's taken this decision out of benevolence, that he wants to end the suffering of all the peoples engaged in the war, and therefore he decides to terminate it. It's a play on words necessary to stifle military resistance, because the military didn't want to surrender, didn't want to give up. But if they're told they have to terminate the war because of condition X and condition Y, they finally accepted it, but never surrender. No.
Is there any sense, though, in Japan today of understanding the Americans' position and some sort of context of the war? So there is an understanding that they had to do what they had to do at all?
Well, there is some understanding of that, and there was more of that, I think, in the 1940s and 50s than there is today. Opinion polls have shown that among the Japanese public, hostility to dropping the bombs has increased enormously over the course of the last 80 years. Um, I mean, you could ask the same question really about Western publics. What do they think about the atomic bomb? And of course, there was a great deal of criticism now, a great deal, a widespread belief that it should not have been dropped. It did not need to be dropped. But on the other hand, there is still widespread support for the idea that America had to end the war, save American lives, and that was the cost. That was the cost.
Yeah. Well, Richard, we could go on for a long time. The book, as I said at the start, throws up so many ideas, thoughts that deserve exploration. Let me just encourage people to buy it. That's Reign of Ruin, which is available now. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for your time today. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much.